Hi everyone, Laila OBoyle here, baking with Simply Bread Co. Right now we're gonna make our dark pan loaves. The first thing in this recipe is I'm gonna add all of my ingredients to the water first and then add that to the flour. It makes it a little bit easier to incorporate everything and make sure that it's evenly distributed in the final dough. So this is water. To the water I'm going to add molasses. This is going to create a really nice, deep, rich flavor. It does add a little bit of sweetness, but not that much. I also really like the dark color that it brings to the loaves. Some brown sugar. There's already molasses in the brown sugar if you want, and if you don't want to go to the store and you only have white sugar, you can sub that in. A little bit of salt and olive oil. Again, you can add any kind of oil that you like, but olive oil adds a little bit of a nice deep flavor. Mix that together, and then I'm gonna add my active starter to this as well. If you're doing this in a stand mixer, it doesn't really matter what order you do this in. But since I'm hand mixing, I wanna give myself a little leg up, make it a little bit easier to mix later on. One good indicator that your starter is ready to be used is that it floats. That means that as it was rising and as the yeast is consuming all of the sugars and starches in your flour, it means that it's holding those air bubbles in. But if your starter isn't floating, that doesn't mean you can't use it. It's just one indication that it might be ready. A lot of times people message me or I chat with other bakers and they say, but I can't use my starter yet because it's not floating. Well, if you used a good amount of whole grains or rye in your starter, it's not going to float. It might never float. So don't use that as your only indicator of starter readiness. That's just one way that you can check. This doesn't have to be totally homogeneous, doesn't have to be something that takes forever. It's just little extra step here. In here I've got all-purpose flour, type 85, and whole wheat. I'm going to slowly pour this in. Is it weird that I'm excited to put my fingers in here? So as I mix, I'll explain to you why I'm using these different flours. All-purpose flour is always nice to use because not only is it going to generally be your cheapest flour, but it's a good baseline to start with breads. Everybody's always got it in their house. It adds a softness, a nice texture in your mouth. The T85, the 85 just indicates how much of the bran and germ they've sifted out after they've milled the flour. If you see a higher number, that means that it's more whole grain, and if you see a lower number, then it's super fine. So like when you're making pizza and you want a super, super white flour that's very fine grained, that's type 00. We're using an 85 in here, so they've sifted out some of the germ and bran, but have kept some in. And then to further deepen the flavor and have a little bit more nutrition, I've used whole wheat flour as well. That means that they haven't taken out any of the bran or germ, and that's where all of the nutrients are. That's where the fiber is, and that's where the vitamins are. And I don't know about you, but I'm always trying to get my kids to eat more breads that are made with whole grain flours. I try to stay away from using a lot of white flours for my kids, because if I can control that, then I know that they're getting nutrition there. And then maybe I'll let them top it with a little bit of Nutella or something like that. So initially I'm still going in with my spatula. You can use a dough whisk. You can do this all by hand. Don't forget to scrape down on all the sides. It's very easy to miss the corners. Now that I've initially got it going, I'm going to put my hands in there. Why am I using my hands? Well, the biggest reason why I'm using my hands, besides the fact that I like to, because I like to touch it, I feel it connects me to the dough. And honestly, we all need to connect to ingredients, to the earth. We can't always just be touching our phones and computers. We need to have things that ground us. And touching this, for me, it grounds me. It's dough therapy. But also, as I squeeze it, I can feel if there are any pockets of dried flour in there, anywhere where it needs to continue getting mixed. And you know, a spatula is not going to feel that for you. So you have to use your eyes and your feel. And even right now, I can really smell that molasses and olive oil. It smells delicious already. As always with the initial dough mix, it looks like it's not going to be anything. You think to yourself, how is this going to turn into bread or anything that resembles dough? But it'll get there. Right now, all we're doing is making sure there are no clumps of flour. We're going to go in and develop the gluten a little later on. But even as I'm standing here, as I lift up the dough, there's little clumps of flour in the bottom. And I think a lot of people tend to miss that, even with your mixer. So if you're mixing this in a stand mixer, make sure that you scrape down the sides and the bottom of the bowl, because when you find that hidden flour, there's really nothing you can do about it once the dough has been sitting. So you see when I lift it up, how it just clumps, it's not sticking together at all. We're gonna let it sit for about 20 minutes. We're gonna let the flour absorb all the liquid in there, and we'll see how it transforms even just in the next 20 minutes. All right, so after our initial mix, we let our dough rest for about 20 minutes, still looking really rough. I'm gonna go ahead and do my first fold. I'm just picking it up and stretching it. This first one, the dough is still really not together, so however you can pick it up and stretch it works. You're not going to really be able to do a coil fold on it because it hasn't had enough time to develop yet. So all you're doing is moving it around and starting to get the gluten developing. Once you feel it start to tighten up a little bit and come together just slightly, you can put your lid back on and leave it for another 20 minutes. All right, we've let our dough rest and folded it 2 more times, and now given it another 20 minutes. So it's been folded 3 times now, and we're gonna do our 4th fold. Wet hands. And now it's starting to come more together. It wants to stay together versus sticking to the tub. When you're dealing with this large amount, I like to flip it around to make it a little easier on myself. And then sideways. All we're doing here is manipulating the dough so that the gluten is stretching, which strengthens the gluten. And now while we let it rest, it's going to relax again. The next step is going to be dumping it out, weighing it, and then shaping it into the loaves. All right, after doing all of our folds and letting the dough rest a bit, finishing its bulk, we're now going to dump it out, cut it, weigh it, and pre-shape it. I like to help it out a little bit. Isn't that a beautiful dough? Each dough ball is going to be approximately 875 grams. Doesn't matter if you get it right or not. You can always add or take away. It doesn't ruin anything in the dough when there's little bits. I am the worst at eyeballing these, as you can see. Whenever it starts to get a little sticky, you can just dip your hands in a little water and it'll help keep it manageable. I like to think as the bench scraper as an extension of my hand. And because the Simply Bread oven is slightly bigger than a lot of 3-deck ovens that you can find of this range, I can fit 15 loaves, which is really nice. And then this one's a little bit short because I was being generous, so I'm just going to go around, take a little bit from each one. Yeah, so I would say that generally in baking, if you're talking about a cake, if you're talking about cookies, you do have to be really exact. When you're talking about baking bread, and especially sourdough, it's much more of something that you can do by feel. So if you are somebody who's not really into exact numbers, it's a little bit intimidating for you, I actually think sourdough is a great place to start because depending on your ambient temperature, depending on where you get your flour, things are going to be different. And I actually think a lot of people are really intimidated by sourdough and have a hard time coming up with a good product because they stick to the recipes too much. So with sourdough, you really have to watch your dough and not the recipe and not the time. You have to make sure that it's showing signs that it's ready. And if you kind of mess up by putting too much starter in, or maybe you put in too little water, there's a lot that can be done to fix that. And it doesn't just necessarily ruin a recipe. That's totally different than like cookies. If you add way too much flour to a cookie dough, it's not going to work. That's not to say that you can't mess up a loaf of sourdough, but I think there's a lot more wiggle room in there and it's much more intuitive than a lot of other baking. So if you want to start somewhere and you're feeling intimidated by baking, you could start by making your own bread. I'm going to grab my pastry boards to start letting these rise. I'm pre-shaping right now to give myself a really nice starting point. So I'm just using my bench scraper to kind of tighten the bottom of them, and then I'm going to set them on here and I'm going to let them relax again before we shape them into our pans. So you actually want the bottom of the dough to be sticking a little bit to your countertop, because that's how you create the tension. See how I'm pulling it in and then I'm dragging it by the bottom to create the tension on the top of the dough. Now that I've got 5 on here, little jigglies, we're gonna set those aside. I find it very satisfying to slam the dough on there. Now this recipe is a fairly high hydration. If you want to take it down because it has too much water and it feels intimidating to you, just like we were talking about before, that you can adjust sourdough bread based on what you need, you can totally just use less water in this recipe. You'll still have a great outcome. It'll taste delicious, but the dough will be a little bit easier for you to work with. All right, we're gonna let these rest for about 20-30 minutes, really let them settle down so the gluten relaxes so I can manipulate it again. And then we're going to shape them into our pans. So we've let our dough rest for a little while. It's been sitting at room temperature for about 30 minutes. It's nice and spread out. It's a little bit dry on top, which is gonna make the shaping a little bit easier. First thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna spray my loaf pans with a nonstick spray just to ensure that they pop out nicely when they're done baking. Just enough that I feel secure that they're not gonna stick to the bottom. I like to dust the top of my loaves with just a little bit of all-purpose flour to make sure that they don't stick to my countertop when I shape them. I'm gonna use my bench knife to separate the dough from the board. Fold up the ends, tuck in the sides, and then just a nice rolling action. This dough has a really, really nice smell. And because we're using nonstick pans and we coated the pans in a nonstick coating, I don't really put that much on the loaf. I don't really like to do too much because I've noticed that if I use rice flour, it kind of has a little bit of a texture on it, and I want this loaf to be really nice and soft all around. It's a really silky, nice dough to work with. Since it also has the brown sugar in it, it's kind of got that, you know, traditional American like honey whole wheat thing going, where it has a little bit of sweetness. So it's gonna be a little bit more of a sweet dough versus a traditional sourdough artisanal loaf that doesn't have any extra anything in it. We've got the olive oil, the molasses, and the brown sugar. If you notice at this stage that your dough is starting to rip and tear, or that it's really sticking to your fingers a lot, that is a big indicator that you've overproofed your dough and the gluten is starting to break down. When that starts to happen, you basically just want to move as fast as you can and get it in the loaf pans and then in the fridge as fast as possible. And then maybe don't do too long of a cold proof, because it is going to continue proofing for a little bit in the fridge while it cools down. So you don't want to leave it for more than maybe like 8 hours if you feel that it's got it getting overproofed. And any time that it starts to stick to your fingers, you can just take a little bowl of flour and kind of dust your fingers on there, tap them together to shake off the excess, and then it'll stop sticking to you again. No, I actually don't really always do the same shape. I kind of let the dough tell me what it wants. If it starts to fight me, then I do like a little bit less. I think a more traditional shaping is what I'm doing now, which is where you just tuck in both sides and then you just roll it up. I'm feeling that this dough is really nice and loose and jiggly, so I was kind of giving it a little more structure before. But with a pan loaf, since you're baking it in a pan, you're getting all of that support. It has nowhere to go except up. So it's not as important how carefully you shape with pan loaves as with like an artisanal sourdough loaf, because those freeform loaves, they don't have any direction with a pan. They can kind of spread outwards a lot more than these. These guys have the pan keeping them from spreading too much. So you can kind of go with however you feel, but you definitely want to give it like that twisting. I also recommend, if you're ever baking at home and you are making an artisanal sourdough loaf that you want to be a free-form loaf, but it's super overproofed, and as you're trying to shape it, it's kind of falling apart. At that point, you might want to pivot to a pan loaf, because then again, you're providing that support for the loaf and the dough doesn't have anywhere else to go, versus baking it free form, then it's could end up like a puddle. If you're baking it in one of these pans, then you're kind of giving it a little bit of extra support. I also recommend, like, if you're feeling super intimidated by shaping, you can also pop it into a pan loaf, because then again, there's just not as much pressure to get a tight shaping going. And you can see that these are starting to dry out a little bit, so it's good that I'm not leaving it longer. And when I squish down the edges after I've rolled it, it's just so that you don't have a little dough bubble butt at the ends there. You can see the spiral, and that's okay, but I kind of like to just give it a little bit more uniformity by kind of squeezing down there on the ends. And then you can also go away from your body if you want. That's how some bakers do it. Instead of rolling towards yourself, a little bit of squeezing there and into the pan. From here, they're gonna go straight into the fridge. If you tend to underproof your dough and you're at this stage and you feel like, oh my gosh, I just shaped this way too early. It's not bubbly, it's not ready at all. You can leave it out in the pan and let it get a little bit bigger, rise a little bit more. And then you can put it in the fridge for cold proof. So we've got all of our loaves done. They're looking really good. We're gonna stick them in the fridge and bake them off tomorrow morning. My molasses and brown sugar olive oil pan loaves were in the fridge overnight, about 18 hours. I've just pulled them from the fridge. They're still cold. We're gonna bake them cold into the oven. I'm gonna show you a couple of different ways that you can score them. Usually I just do one straight score across the top. If you wanna be fancy, you can always add a cute little wheat stock, which is traditionally on the artisanal loaves, but if you're trying to impress some guests, you just wanna be cute, it looks cute when it comes out of the oven. Or you can do a couple of kind of diagonal scores across the top as well. All you're really trying to do is create a spot where the extra steam can release from. If you don't do this, then the top crust will kind of create a barrier and you might have big pockets in random spots of the dough. Especially with a sandwich loaf like this, a pan loaf, we don't want huge pockets at all. We don't want huge air bubbles in any spots. We don't want your butter falling out. We don't want our kids complaining about our peanut butter and jelly getting all over the place. So you can kind of score it however you'd like, as long as you give that steam a place to escape. I usually just do one across the top. We'll do a few diagonally. And then if you like toppings on your bread, before you put it in the fridge, you can lightly wet it with water and coat it in oats, seeds, anything that you think is delicious. Traditionally, whole wheat loaves have oats on top of them. People really like that. We decided to keep it simple this time. So now that all of my loaves are scored, I'm gonna pop them in the oven. Have my Simply Bread oven preheated to 450 degrees. I've loaded my water valve, my water reserve with water, and we're gonna load them up. 5 per deck. Of course, you're gonna lose some heat while the oven door is open. We're really baking with the heat of the stones right now, so it's not a big deal. Don't panic about that. All right. Firmly close the oven door. Check that your steam is up, that you're not gonna release the steam right away. We're gonna do steam 5 because I want it to be really nice and humid in there in the beginning of the bake. Push the button, watch it steam, all that magic. This is the only oven on the market that's a 3-deck oven like this, that you can have a single phase oven that has steam injection. That's what makes this oven super special. All right, and then we're going to turn the heating elements off for the first part of the bake. This is so that the top crust has extra time to be in a steamy environment before it forms. If the crust forms too early, then you're hindering the potential of the bread to bloom and be as open and as light and fluffy as it can be. We're gonna give it about 20 minutes at this temperature with the elements off, and then we're gonna release the steam and turn the elements of the oven back on. So it's been about 20 minutes. We're gonna release the steam over here on the right side, open it up, and we're gonna turn the oven back on to 450. Don't get worried that it only says 355 up here or whatever temperature. We're still using the heat from the stones to cook the bread. Now the elements are gonna turn on and brown the bread for the rest of the bake. We'll leave it for another 25 minutes or so and pull it out when I reach my desired color. You might like baking your bread lighter or darker, that's up to you. The pan loaves have been in the oven for another 30 minutes or so with the elements on to let them brown, and they're looking beautiful. We've got a nice ear, beautiful brown crust. They rose nicely. I'm very happy with that. Can smell the aroma of the brown sugar and the molasses in there. Here's one that I scored diagonally, how that came out. I love this part just to make sure that any fears that I had about how the baking went at this moment is where you kind of take that sigh of relief and go, okay, great, they look good. Pretty soon after you take them out, you want to release them from the loaves. Once they've come out of the oven, you want to get them out of the pan pretty quickly because they're going to steam themselves. So I like to give a big knock on the corner, and then it should hopefully just pop right out. And then find a rack where they can cool down without steaming. There we go. This is the beauty of the Simply Bread oven. I've never had any burned bottoms. It really maintains heat well, doesn't let the stones overheat, and look. A hollow sound like that tells you that the dough is done. The bread is done. It should be at about 200 degrees of internal temperature. If you ever have issues with your bread sticking to a pan, you can run a really fine paring knife around the edges just to release the outside, and then you only have the bottom sticking. That can help you a little bit when you're struggling with the dough sticking, but that's why we used a nonstick pan and spray. All right, here are our molasses sandwich loaves. I'm going to show you how they turned out on the inside, and then we're going to spread our homemade butter on them. If you prefer, you can make this recipe with all different kinds of flours. Came out really nice and soft and fluffy. Really good way to know if you have baked your loaf long enough is if you give it a squeeze and then it pops right open again. Super soft and fluffy. You can smell the aroma of the molasses and a little bit of sweetness from the brown sugar. Adding olive oil or any sort of fat to a loaf of bread adds a really nice soft quality to the interior of it. Nothing like fresh, slightly salty butter on a still, warm slice of bread. So good.